In the second half of Lamentations chapter 3, the man who has seen affliction makes affirmations about God as well as praise to God. So starting in verse 25, he says, God is good to those who wait on him, to the soul who seeks him. It is good that he waits with hope and is silent for the deliverance of Yahweh. It is good for the man that he bears the yoke in his youth. Let him sit alone and be silent, because he, Yahweh, has laid it on him. For the Lord will not cast off forever, for if he causes grief, then will come compassion like the abundance of his loving kindnesses. For he does not afflict from his heart, nor does he grieve human beings from his heart. Who is this who has spoken, if it was not that the Lord had commanded? Is it not from the mouth of the Most High that go out evil calamity and good things? I called on your name, Yahweh, from the lowest pit. My voice may you hear. Do not hide your ear from my relief, from my deliverance. May you draw near on the day when I call to you. May you say, do not fear. May you plead, Lord, the dispute of my soul. May you redeem my life. As we mentioned in the previous session, the purpose of the lament in the Man of Afflictions here, prayer in chapter 3, is the purpose is instructive. In other words, it's designed to demonstrate how to react and to respond to God in the midst of calamity. And through the Man of Afflictions lament, he instructs as well as models to the original community and to us how to pray and what to focus on in the midst of affliction. So in the Man of Afflictions lament, he states the theological basis of our finding our hope in God, which is God's loving kindness and compassion, as well as he gives an example of what our posture toward God should be like in the midst of trauma. Now, as a model prayer, in the previous session, I mentioned 4 things about this poem here in chapter 3. One is, we saw that there is in this poem a roller coaster of emotions and spiritual moods, that the Man of Affliction fluctuates between despair and hope. And thus, as a result of that, we need to acknowledge both hope and despair as being the legitimate emotional responses to trauma. And we need to accept and embrace both of them as part of our spiritual journey. And that in this poem, despair is linked to the circumstances, while hope is linked to God. But as a result of that, then, with respect to the circumstances of trauma, lament is a legitimate, appropriate, and even a necessary expression of our faith. And we should and can give full expression of the despair in the situation. We should give full expression of that to God in prayer. But also then, the 4th lesson from this is that the purpose of lament is to shift the focus off of the circumstances which do evoke despair, and shift our focus onto God, and thus moving us toward hope. Now, in highlighting those 4 points, the focus is more on the example of the way or the manner in which the Man of Affliction responds to the trauma he is in. That the Man of Affliction models that we are to lament and turn to God in prayer in the midst of disaster, affliction, destruction. In this section, as we continue in chapter 3, I want to look more at the content of the Man of Affliction's response to God with respect to his posture toward God. That what does an appropriate posture entail or include? Or what kind of posture does the man of affliction instruct us to take in the midst of prayer? And one of the first things that we see is that he informs us that the appropriate and acceptable posture is that of humbly submitting to God. So, what does humbly submitting to God involve? Well, the man of affliction's lament highlights kind of two things as he humbly submits to God. The first is the theological recognition that all circumstances are under God's control, even the current calamity. That as the man of affliction begins his lament, he attributes the circumstances of his distress to being from the hand of God. Says me, he, Yahweh, has driven and made to walk in darkness and not in light. Surely against me he repeatedly turned his hand all the day. He caused my flesh and my skin to waste away. He broke my bones. He built a wall against me and encompassed me with bitterness and hardship. In dark places he made me dwell like those who have been dead a long time. He walled me in, and I cannot go out. He made heavy my bronze chain. He walled my ways with hewn stone. He made my paths crooked. A bear lying in wait he is to me, a lion in secret places. My ways he turned aside. He tore me to pieces. He utterly desolated me. He bent his bow. He set me like a target for an arrow. He made to enter into my kidneys the arrows of his quiver. He filled me with bitterness. He made me drink wormwood, and he broke with gravel my teeth. He made me cower in the dust. And likewise, the community follows suit in verses 43 and 45 in speaking to Yahweh and saying, you covered with anger and you pursued us. You slayed and you did not spare. As garbage and refuse, you have placed us in the midst of the people. In other words, the man of affliction and the community both fully recognize that God is the one who has done this. And even though the man of affliction does not like what has happened, even though he voices complaint about the suffering that he has endured, and even though to him the affliction seems like it is over the top or excessive, nevertheless, he accepts that it has come from God. Now, we do need to note, again, that chapter 3 must be read in the context of the preceding poem, where a key theological perspective is that the people have sinned, and what has occurred is the divine judgment for their corporate sins. And such is even referenced here in chapter 3, where the man of affliction instructs, why should a living human complain, a man, concerning his sin? And then the community acknowledges in verses 40 and 42, let us examine our ways and probe them. Let us return to Yahweh. As for us, we transgressed and we rebelled. But the posture taken in this poem by the man of affliction and the community is that of humble acceptance, that the suffering comes from the hand of God. And we find that theological position summarized by the man of affliction there in verse 38. Is it not from the mouth of the Most High that go out evil calamity and good things? And when he says this, we need to note that he is not talking here about that which is morally evil or morally good, as if God is the source of moral evil. Rather, the evil and the good that he is talking about refers here to the situations and the things that occur in life. And within the context, the Old Testament context of the covenant relationship, this refers to the evil consequences of the covenant curses that stem from the people's disobedience, and the good covenant blessings which result from when the people are obedient to God. And the man of affliction here places all events that happen to God's covenant people, both the good things that happen as well as the bad things, the calamities, the disasters, that everything is acknowledged as under the control of God. A very similar statement is found in the book of Ecclesiastes, Ecclesiastes 7:14, where the wisdom teacher there says, in the day of goodness, in other words, when good things are happening, says be in the good. In other words, be happy. When good things are happening, be happy. And in the day of evil calamity, consider also this as well as that God has made both. Now, although the man of affliction's complaint here in Lamentations 3 in verses 1 through 20, where he declares that God has done all of this afflicting, that lament does carry an accusatory tone. But nevertheless, the man of God does not rail against God in the sense that he does not conclude that God is therefore unworthy to be worshiped because of the affliction that God has brought. Nor does the man of affliction philosophically argue that since God is a God of love, that which has happened to him, it obviously cannot then come from the hand of God. Nor does the man of affliction abandon his covenant relationship with God in light of what he perceives that God has done to him and to the community. Again, rather, the man of affliction's posture is one of humbly submitting to God. And thus, in verses 27 to 30, he instructs, it is good for the man that he bears the yoke. And in this case, the yoke, we need to understand it in the sense of yoke is referred to in chapter 1, verse 14, that it is the yoke of punishment for their transgressions. It is good for the man that he bears the yoke in his youth. Let him sit alone and be silent because he, Yahweh, has laid it on him. Let him place his mouth in the dust. Let him give his cheek to the one who smites him. That the posture advocated by the man of affliction, that posture is sometimes, I think, hard for us as moderns to assume. That in the midst of our suffering and disaster, we'd like to protest that this should not be happening. Or we like to philosophically discuss whether what is occurring is an act of justice or not. We like to discuss the character of God and then come to conclusions about what God should or should not do based upon our evaluation of who God is. That we as moderns, I think oftentimes we do have a hard time accepting the first part of verse 38. Is it not from the mouth or through the command of the Most High that goes out evil calamity? Rather, we as moderns want to approach the whole thing from the issue of theodicy, of debating and discussing how can a good God allow bad things to happen? Whereas the man of affliction, from a stance of faith, humbly submits, allowing God to be God, allowing God to do what God has decided to do. And the man of affliction accepts it, humbly submits to it, while lamenting what has happened. But again, he never defiantly rejects God or fight against what God has done, nor does the man of affliction theologically strip what has happened from God's hand. That humbly submitting involves recognizing that all circumstances are under God's control. But humbly submitting also involves recognizing that we can only change our inner perspective. we can only reorient ourselves toward God. We cannot change the outward circumstances. Only God can do that. This is expressed in verses 25 and following. God, Yahweh, is good to those who wait on him, to the soul who seeks him. It is good that he waits with hope and is silent for the deliverance of Yahweh. Let him sit alone and be silent. And again in verse 49, he says, my eyes are poured out, and they are not silent from there being no relief until Yahweh looks down and he sees from the heavens. The man of affliction recognizes that nothing will happen until Yahweh acts. Now, given that there in verses 26 and 28, the man of affliction advocates, let the man be silent. But then in verse 49, the man of affliction is not silent in his weeping and in his crying out to God. We then need to understand the admonition there to be silent in verses 26 and 28. We need to understand it in the sense of inactivity in trying to remedy the situation through one's own efforts or strengths or plans. In other words, the posture of humbly submitting to God means the posture of not trying to humanly rectify or make right the situation, yet coupled with a faith that God can and will do something. So we are inactively silent until he acts. Now, just a cautionary note, unless we broaden this too widely or make it into a universal application of being completely passive in all situations of disaster, we must again recognize that this is the advocated advice in this specific situational context of when the disaster is the consequence of human sinful actions. That when such is the case, the prerequisite for any effective restorative action is the divine initiative of forgiving. And in that kind of context, all human efforts will fall short in reversing the effects of the trauma. Only subsequent to the divine redemptive action can any further human response result in a restorative rebuilding. So that our humble submission is based on the recognition that only God is capable of initiating that which is necessary to bring healing and restoration. That all human efforts will fall short in reversing the trauma. Therefore, we need to reorient our focus toward God and place our attention on God. And it is that reorienting ourselves toward God which leads to the second posture that the man of affliction demonstrates in advocates. That the man of affliction instructs we are to cry out to God. Yahweh is good to those who wait on him, to the soul who seeks him. And then the man of affliction in his prayer demonstrates what he did. I called on your name, Yahweh, from the lowest pit. May you draw near on the day when I call to you. And the community echoes that in verse 41. As they cry out to God, we lift up our hearts upon our hands to God in the heavens. In fact, the whole lament of chapter 3 of the man of affliction, it is precisely his crying out to God in prayer. And again, in verses 57 to 59, he very specifically informs of his posture in the midst of this crisis. He said, I called on your name, Yahweh, from the lowest pit. My voice may you hear. Do not hide your ear from my relief, for my deliverance. May you draw near on the day when I call to you. May you say, do not fear. May you plead, Lord, the dispute of my soul. May you redeem my life. May you see, Yahweh, my oppression. Judge my case. The man of affliction pleads, he laments, he cries out to God to come to the rescue. So the man of affliction entrusts his case and his situation to Yahweh. He asks Yahweh to plead his case and to take the appropriate and just action. So again, even though back in verses 26 and 28, the man of affliction has said that one should be silent in the sense of human activity, of being inactive with respect to trying to solve the situation, such does not mean verbal silence. It does not mean that we should not cry out or call out to God in prayer. That even when God is seemingly silent in hearing and speaking to us, we should not be verbally silent of not speaking to him. And in this lament, we note that both the man of affliction and the community are deeply feeling that God is not hearing their prayers. Back in verse 8, the man of affliction said, also when I cry out and I call for deliverance, he shuts out my prayers. And the community echoes that in verse 44. You covered yourself with a cloud, preventing prayer from passing through. So even though they don't feel like God is hearing or that God is speaking, nevertheless, neither the man of affliction or the community are silent in continuing to call out to God. Their posture is a total opposite of what is often a typical reaction. God, you won't talk to me, then I won't talk to you. No, the man of affliction and the community do not give God the silent treatment. And so this lament does give us a great example that the appropriate and acceptable posture to take is that of crying out to God. That even when God seems to be silent in hearing and speaking to us, we should not be silent in calling out to him. That we are to persistently plead with him to intervene, to come to our aid, to bring healing and restoration. And thus the second posture exemplified is that of crying out to God in the midst of our distress. And the third posture, the appropriate and acceptable posture to take, is to wait with hope for God. Stated most prominently in verses 21 to 26. This I recall to my heart, therefore I will wait with hope. The loving kindnesses of Yahweh, indeed, they never come to an end. Indeed, his compassions are never finished. They are new in the mornings. Abundant is your faithfulness. My portion is Yahweh, my soul says, therefore I will wait with hope in him. God is good to those who wait on him, to the soul who seeks him. It is good that he waits with hope and is silent for the deliverance of Yahweh. Now, the Hebrew term that is used 3 times in these verses often carries the dual connotation of both waiting and hoping. In other words, it is waiting with expectation, or as translated here, waiting with hope. And this kind of waiting contrasts with the kind of waiting whose primary connotations is simply persevering until something happens. Rather, this waiting with hope carries a sense of assurance that God hears the weeping, God hears the lamenting. God hears the pleas for help. And this waiting with hope carries the assurance that God will do something. So we expectantly wait and hope for that intervention from God. Again, as expressed in verses 21 to 26, waiting in expectation or waiting in hope is based on who God is. It is based on God's love and compassion and faithfulness. The man of affliction affirms the loving kindnesses, the compassion, the faithfulness of God, while attributing the suffering and the disaster to God. To the man of affliction, the two are not mutually exclusive. Love of God does not rule out just punishment, nor does disaster coming from God rule out God's love. Yet it is the loving kindness of God that gives the man of the affliction the ability to adopt a posture of expectant waiting. It's reiterated in verses 31 to 33. For the Lord will not cast off forever, for if he causes grief, then will come compassion, like the abundance of his loving kindnesses. For he does not afflict from his heart, nor does he grieve human beings from his heart. The one hopefully waits in the midst of disaster and calamity and trauma with the knowledge that even though God does afflict, the character of God is weighted toward love and compassion and restoration. And that same posture of waiting with hope is also expressed in the lament psalm, Psalm 130, where many of the same emphases occur as found here in Lamentations 3. That the psalmist cries out to God in petitions, requesting God's help, with an expectant waiting for Yahweh to help, based upon Yahweh's loving kindness, which results in forgiveness and restoration. From the depths I've cried to you, Yahweh. Lord, listen to my voice. Let your ears be attentive to the voice of my appeals for favor. If our iniquities you retain, Yahweh, then, Lord, who will stand? But with you there is forgiveness, so that you may be reverenced. I wait for Yahweh. My soul does wait, and for his word do I wait with hope. My soul waits with hope for the Lord, more than the watchmen wait for the morning. Israel, wait with hope for Yahweh. For with Yahweh is loving kindness, and abundant with him is redemption. And he will redeem Israel from all of its iniquities. Again, coming back to Lamentations chapter 3, as we look at the posture of the man of affliction in his lament prayer, it is one of humbly submitting to God, while yet crying out to God in full voice of the lament and the complaint, and requesting and petitioning God. But it is done while waiting with hope for God to then act. And again, this is instructive to us as to the posture that we should take in the midst of our traumas and difficulties, so as to help us to work through and to process the traumatic events which we experience in our own lives. And from chapter 3, some questions then for thought as we think about processing trauma and grief. One, how do you react to Lamentations 3:38, that even bad things come from God? Is it not from the mouth of the Most High that go out evil, calamity, and good things? How do you react to that statement? Second, what are some situations where you have desperately cried out to God, pleading for him to intervene, to rescue, and to restore? And in crying out to God in those situations, have you really believed that He will answer? Third, is it hard for you in the midst of difficult times, maybe, for example, the situations you just cited in response to the previous question? Is it hard for you in the midst of those kind of times to wait for the Lord to act, rather than trying to resolve the situation on your own?